so welcome everyone. Welcome, my name is Martin Husovec. I'm Associate Professor here at the Law School, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here for this event, Decoding DSA Risk Assessment and Risk Assessments and Audits. This is actually a title that was produced by ChatGPT because I was literally running out of ideas. I thought decoding is not too bad, hey, there's something that our overlords can give us. The point of today's event is to unpack these risk assessments and audits, not necessarily to unpack specific companies' audits, but more in general. What are these audits showing? What are these risk assessments showing? What can we learn from that? And for those of you who have tried to read these documents, it's pretty big, it's massive. It's probably no one in the room has read all of them. Right? Meaning all VLOP risk assessments and all accompanying audits. So we all are somehow looking at a part of the elephant and trying to name what we see, but it's inevitable, right? There will be always very many documents. As you learn, if you try to read all the Ofcom guidance in the UK, you will always only be able to read parts of it. Only groups and companies are able to really read everything. Okay, so the goal is really to unpack the system, because it's a new system. It's for the first time that we have these risk assessments and these audits. So we want to have a little bit of a general reflection on them. And this is why I thought putting together a panel would be a great way to unpack this, though I invited speakers to also offer their introductory remarks. It can be longer or shorter, it's up to them. But after that, we'll have a discussion chaired by me, and then we also open it to the questions from here. You have priority, but also then from the audience online. This is also webcasted online, so people online can post questions in the chat, and I'll try to pick up. Now, one thing I'd like to say, actually a couple of things. First of all, this event is recorded. So we'll see what we do with a recording. We might make it public, but by participating, you consent to being recorded. Second, the goal of this event is not to grill these individuals on what they have done for specific companies. We should respect that they have NDAs in place and they can't necessarily speak to the details of the work they have done for specific companies. The point is the general reflection, right? Because that's not covered by any sensible NDA, or at least shouldn't be. And that's what we try to unearth, discuss how things are done, whether this is going in a good direction, et cetera, et cetera. So for that reason, I'd like to ask you to formulate your questions in that sort of academic way, not specifically asking whether a particular company has done a good enough job or something like that. So we have three fantastic speakers today. The first speaker will be Professor Lorna, the one and only Professor of Internet Law at the University of Essex, who will give us a little bit of introduction to the risk assessment, also from the perspective of UK, not just the DSA, and then share her views. And then we'll have Agne Kaarlep from Tremau, which is a boutique consultancy focusing on platform issues, OSA and DSA included. I presume everyone in the room knows what OSA and DSA is, so Online Safety Act and Digital Services Act. And finally, we'll have Curtis Barnes, who's a risk management consultant here in London, and he worked for one of the consultancies that was conducting, one of the consultancies that was both helping with audits as well as with consulting. So he has seen that and has also has been involved in some work now from the company's side. So he has a very well-rounded view there, but he's speaking in his personal capacity as an expert. So those are our three speakers. I hope that sounds like a compelling program. And with that, I'd like to invite first Lorna to give some introductory remarks.
Shall I?
Of course, please come here. I think it would be probably better, since although you can get this also in that chair, so it's up to you completely.
I don't mind.
Oh, there you go.
Might see my notes better.
If you like to move, you see, I couldn't sit still while talking, so.
See if I can get the tech to work. Right. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction. Couple of remarks before I dive into this. As Martin said, I'm going to talk briefly about the Online Safety Act in passing, but it's not going to be a full formal comparison of the two regimes, just, I suppose, points where I think something's interesting. The other point is that this bit, my introductory marks, won't cover audits, just in terms of not talking for too long. I thought I'd like to start with a general remark about the approach I think you see in both the DSA and the Online Safety Act about what we're regulating and why we're regulating it. On the left-hand side of the screen, we've got a quote from Sean Parker, the co-founder of Facebook, and this was back in 2017. And I'm not going to read that out to you, but I think the quote shows us a couple of things. That the services are designed, that they don't fly in from outer space pre-formulated. They're a result of choices by engineers, by other people in companies. And they are designed to achieve a specific goal, usually increased engagement for ad revenue purposes. And we can all drift off and read Chissano's Zuboff and talk about surveillance capitalism. The other point you can get from Sean Parker's quote is that some services at least are aware that there might be side effects to the design choices they make. And I think the sentence, "God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains," perhaps signals that. But nonetheless, they chose to go on. And I suppose a risk assessment and risk mitigation framework is a response to that. To say, okay, nothing's perfect, but please just don't ignore problems. And we see with successive whistleblowers that there are perhaps companies that have ignored internal warnings from various parts of their staff. So both the Online Safety Act and the Digital Services Act are in a way trying to return responsibility to the platforms around their design choices, their business model as well. It's not directly about regulating content. Content regulation, if you like, happens the next layer up. Clearly, the two have a relationship. It's not possible to say Chinese wall between the two. But what we are actually regulating is perhaps system design, operational choices, and that sort of thing. The other side of the screen, you can see a diagram from Carnegie UK Trust. I picked that just to illustrate the cyclical nature of these things. It's not just do it once and forget it. It's assess, respond, measure, reassess. So it's a cycle, but it is perhaps also a virtuous cycle, because hopefully what we're going to see is an improvement. It's not a fairy waving a magic wand. It's not immediate. It's not overnight. It's not going to be complete. It's a process of improvement. And Curtis and I were just talking now, and we were saying, when we're talking about measuring, what is our benchmark for measuring? Is it where we are now, and then we measure the next stage? Or are we measuring total improvement from, a completely no safety, no trust and safety mechanism? So that's a question maybe to come back to. So this is just laying out the two systems. We can see on the left-hand side the DSA, the whole regime, not just the risk assessment sections, are aiming at a safe, predictable and trusted online environment. The similarities, I suppose, in what the Online Safety Act includes in its objectives, which is that services should be safe by design. Both regimes do emphasise the importance of human rights, specifically freedom of expression. So taking that idea of safety, but also being aware of the importance of freedom of expression, of privacy. So Article 34 is the risk assessment provision. Article 35 is that response, the risk mitigation duties. We've got equivalents in the Online Safety Act, but it's structured differently. And I suppose this is one point to reflect on, that in the Online Safety Act, you have got a distinction between types of service, between what we can call social media and search, and the risk assessment duties are slightly different between those two categories. Whereas in the Digital Services Act, the obligation is just the same across the board. But given the, I suppose, the openness of the language, to what extent is there actually going to be, a difference in practice? Will those distinctions show through in the nature of the business, in the risk assessment? The other point to note is that the Online Safety Act distinguishes between illegal content and children's risk assessment. As I said, slightly different there as well. So it's a question of, have we got one risk assessment or a series? Is that difference actually between the two regimes more theoretical or formal legal than what's going to happen in practice? And I think that's interesting when we start looking perhaps globally around other regimes that are picking up a risk assessment model. To what extent do differences in language, formal structures, actually disappear in practice? You've got qualitative thresholds for both, suitable and sufficient from the Online Safety Act. With the DSA, it's to diligently identify, analyse and assess systemic risks. Now, Ofcom said that suitable and sufficient means you have to look at all the issues listed in the Act. I don't know if that is the same as diligently identify, analyse and assess or not. So that's a question perhaps the other panellists would reflect on. We've got a question of who. Articles 34, 35 in the DSA apply to very large online platforms and, added at the last minute, very large online search engines. It looks narrower in terms of who it applies to than the Online Safety Act, and I think it's probably pretty clear that it is. The Online Safety Act applies to all regulated services, so all services falling within the definition of user to user, which can include messaging and gaming, and all search. So clearly covering a broader range, but I sometimes wonder if we lose sight of the potential breadth of the DSA because it sits against a wider remit in general. So the DSA in general applies to a much wider range of types of service than the Online Safety Act, which is pretty much just about social media and search. We still have to reflect on the fact, though, that lots of small services are going to be caught by the Online Safety Act, and that perhaps lots of small services sitting outside the UK, but satisfying the territorial conditions, because the Online Safety Act has extraterritoriality, may not yet have caught up with this. Having said that, I suspect small, low-risk platforms, wherever they are, is probably not going to be high on Ofcom's enforcement priorities, especially if they're based somewhere else. Systemic harms are the key term in the Digital Services Act. And it's unclear what we mean by systemic. If we look to where systemic has been used elsewhere, say financial services, we could end up with a very broad understanding of the term. Are we talking about the internet system as a whole? Are we talking about things arising from one particular platform? So it is unclear. Digital Services Act gives us a list. It gives us 4 top-line headings, each of which are then broken down. These headings are actually in themselves quite broad. Think about illegal content, bearing in mind that's illegal content either at European level or in member states. Fundamental human rights, it's any of them. So question in my mind is, what actually falls outside those 4 categories if we're worrying about what systemic risks are? And, you know, your chance to contribute to the development of jurisprudence in this field is to suggest what could be systemic that's not in those 4 categories already. In terms of contrasts with the UK system, one point to note is that these are societal risks, or at least include societal risks. In theory, societal risks are outside the Online Safety Act. That's very much focused on individual harm, though it can be individual harm to groups. And I do wonder whether this ties back to the fact that we are looking here at very large platforms that are going to have a society level impact. So that the centre of this is this concern about spread and society level concerns. I would say that although the Online Safety Act identifies illegal content and content harmful to children, they are still pretty broad categories. The design, the functioning and the use of the service is what we're looking at. It's not directly on content, though I think to a certain extent you are going to get content discussions coming in terms of the use of the service. The article was restructured during the legislative process, and we sort of now have this distinction between 34.1, which basically identifies, you know, the types of harm, and then 34.2, broadly speaking, has how that happens. So looking at the functionalities that can exacerbate or contribute to these problems. The Online Safety Act assessment focuses on functionalities as well, but I think it's important to note that there are differences between the 2 lists, and one I've noticed is ad delivery. It's not clearly in the Online Safety Act, though it is clearly there in Article 34.2. What do we measure? I think stemming from is a slightly ambiguous phrase. Are we talking about things that have been caused or things that the system contributes to? And then there's the point about what's our baseline. It is actually a very complex assessment because we are not looking at individual items of content. We're not saying, ooh, is this individual piece of content good or bad? Your risk assessment is forward-looking, and it is looking at categories of behaviour, categories of content, the way functionalities may operate in aggregate. That's quite difficult. You then have the fact that the harms that you've got to take into account may not all point in the same direction. I guess the classic example will be a concern about suppressing and removing particular types of illegal speech against concerns about freedom of expression. Having said that, even freedom of expression isn't straightforward. The case law we have tends to come from individual items of content. There is no clear understanding, and I don't think much in the way of theoretical work, about how you move that jurisprudence based on individual items to generic categories of content. And that's what, in a sense, we're asking to do. You can see even in the human rights categories, you may get conflicts between rights. You may even get conflicts between different versions of freedom of expression. This idea of forward-looking is a problem if we think about the criminal law. And I've worried about this particularly because the Online Safety Act does talk about illegal content. The problem is that the law tends not to criminalise content, but the behaviours of people. So when you're looking at criminal behaviour, you're looking for your mental element, you're looking for a certain cognitive capacity, as well as the activity. How do you get that in a forward-looking analysis? You just don't have the information. One final big difference, I suppose, between the Online Safety Act and the DSA is the role ascribed to the regulator. Poor old Ofcom has been tasked with producing various documents, which it has done at great length. But in that are risk profiles, which tell companies a little bit about how the regulator's seeing risk, but also guidance on how you do a risk assessment. And that is all I have to say, for the time being at least. Sorry, did I run on?
No, that was great. That was great. That was great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Lorna. So we'll do them all. Yes, of course, please. We'll have a discussion afterwards, so we won't have to do a Q&A after each. So next would be Agne. And actually, I was reminded when Lorna was posing these questions about what does systemic mean? Why do we have these categories? What is so broad? What was intended? I forgot to mention that Agne was one of the people working in the team when the DSA was drafted. So perhaps along other things that she can tell us is also what she thinks about all of those things. Agne, it's up to you if you want to stand or sit. Completely up to you. But we have to put on your slides.
I can never get those clickers to work.
No?
No, I just,
Did this work?
I don't know, I didn't try. I just have a bad experience with them.
Let me see. Let me see if it works.
I like it more from the pulpit, to be honest. You know,
You're making me stand. Fine.
no, don't.
Fine, I'll stand up.
There you go.
I'm not going to, so don't feel obliged to.
All right. So I spent a little bit of time reading the reports. I haven't read all of them. Reading actually the reports and the audits. That's a lot of pages. So for anyone embarking on that journey, exercise caution with that. It's a lot of pages. You'll want to kind of get some coffee to go with it, chocolates, things like that. I'm going to try and give you some snippets of what could be interesting, what could be relevant, and this is just a piece, right, of it, right? So if you know, it's just a small piece. Maybe before I start, this is from a European Commission press release. So is this bringing a new era of transparency and accountability? Is this helping to protect users in society? I mean, I think those are like relevant things to consider whether we're getting there. Just one thing I want to say as a disclaimer, yes, to at least the transparency part, because we do need to think kind of what actually has been published are pages and pages of discussions on companies, internal controls, and their risks, and people have actually thought about it. People have gone in and done painful exercises within these companies to figure out how do we explain this, how do we present these things. And so one thing I would say, yes. The other thing I would say, this is the very, very, very first kind of glimpse that we see it, and this is meant to be in a process to give feedback, to improve. This is not meant to be kind of one-off. So as you're looking at these things and you're like, oh God, this doesn't tell me enough, or this doesn't tell me anything, know that this is, you know, this is the first time anyone does it. And so if we look at what the Commission set out to do with the risk assessments, you have these 4 very broad categories of risks, which potentially have an endless amount of subcategories within them. And no one before these assessments had ever done something that expansive, right? You had human rights impact assessments, you had some assessments which would cover kind of snippets of that, but nothing of this kind of sort. And they were given 4 months to do it. Okay, now it's the 2nd year they've already done it, so yes, there's more time, but this is a really big exercise within a time crunch. So with these disclaimers, I kind of want people to give a little bit of grace. Normally we're kind of, these are large companies, they're supposed to have endless resources, but just a little bit of grace of like, this is really big, and this is very new. So it's also kind of, in analyzing this, we need to keep that in mind. So let's take a look at what happened, kind of, how did companies approach, which I would argue is one of the most kind of clear-cut categories, the dissemination of illegal content categories. So one conclusion is, please do not try to report or kind of analyze or compare the actual risk scores between the companies. One is that I'm not entirely sure it's relevant between, for example, between a marketplace and a social media service anyways, but even between the services themselves, like in terms of kind of what was covered in the assessment, how they grouped, how they, like what were the layers of the assessment itself, those were very, very different. So don't try and kind of compare this. We put this together and we were thinking, would this be interesting? But ultimately what we saw is that there are very, very different approaches. This doesn't mean that any of these approaches are wrong, because the DSA doesn't give or gives extremely limited guidance. And the regulator so far has also not given publicly a lot of guidance on this. But so there's a variation a lot in kind of substance and scoring. In some cases, it's that the scoring of it, it's clear that they have scored it internally, but this is not something they've chosen to make public, which is also legitimate under the DSA. Companies have a discretion to decide how much of this they make public, and here again, the regulator should and can give further indications of what the expectation is. Because unlike Ofcom, the Commission has not given pages of guidance on this. So they've really taken the very opposite route in this particular occasion, but we can expect them to kind of ingest all of this after the 2nd year they've received the reports. But basically companies have followed, and I think you'll see this from the reports, a pretty basic inherent risk controls residual risk approach, most of them, right? They've looked at the hypothetical risk without any controls in place of the dissemination of illegal content on their platform. And then they've scored this in some shape or form. Different companies have given different levels of their methodology out to the public. Some have kind of kept it closer to the chest. Others have been very open about it. Then and some people, some companies have looked at it on the specific category, content category level. Others have given it on the illegal content as a whole category level. You'll also see, for example, tier 1 for Facebook and Instagram as a category, which there means lowest risk. TikTok, for example, chose tiering, which doesn't mean risk at all. It means a prioritization of that particular risk, because even if the risk of child sexual abuse material would be low, the priority given to it internally is still very high. So you see that these variations allude to the fact that in order to really understand what a specific company is doing, you actually have to really, really go into the reports themselves. So you can't make these like kind of table comparisons and draw conclusions from them. Because we tried, and you see my slide, just don't. Then there's also just something that you'll see 2023 and 2024 underneath. This is also a fun element. Article 42 of the DSA requires companies to publish these reports, and they requires them to publish the reports 3 months after they receive their audit report. Now that's it, that's all it says. It doesn't specify which risk assessment report needs to be published. The Commission clarified their position on this a few days before the reports were intended to be published. And they said it should be the report of that year, which would mean that the previous year report would never be published. It was a bit unclear in terms of, and I think that unclarity is also visible of kind of what was in the end published. So in addition to the comparability issue, you also potentially need to be aware that you're seeing reports from some companies have published both, some have published only the first year, some have published only the second year. So now this seems kind of bad, right? It's like why, what's the use of this if there's no comparability, everything, it's a mess, they're publishing different years of reports. It's not that bad. I think there's some insights that we can collectively take. So one thing, these are also not necessarily criticisms from my perspective, because it's really, like, the way I've read these reports is that this is kind of the baseline. Everyone has done really their best in trying to understand how to tackle this issue. So I think one of the things we can look at is how should we actually classify the systemic risks. There's different approaches across the companies. It should be and how do we classify the systemic risks? And then also the risk assessment needs to be specific to the service, right? So what would be expected from the different types of companies that are at play, right? The different VLOPs. So, and kind of how that would be, what's the best, what's actually best case in this particular instance. One thing that I think needs to be also thought about or kind of understood is that a lot of, in whichever way companies chose to do it, a lot of them map them to their internal categories of policies, right? And that makes sense, because you can't really discuss what you can't measure. And what they're measuring is, of course, their removals against internal categories of their policies. Because that's what they're reporting, they have transparency reports on, and this is the data that is available, and the data that they have some integrity on, right, as well. Because, I mean, I can spend an entire hour speaking about how complicated it is to actually have integrity in data points on a lot of these issues, right? So a lot of the data that they have are kind of removal, appeal volumes, and prevalence data for companies that actually have a prevalence metric, which is also a complicated metric to come up with and make sure that it runs with integrity. So this also makes sense. So I think when also thinking through about how we should kind of suggest to the companies of what could be better for next year, what could be better, how we could do this exercise in a more meaningful way, we need to kind of understand some of these restrictions. And also, if we're demanding new data points, if we're demanding like, okay, this is not enough, or like this should be more, and understanding that that will take a bit of time. This is a yearly exercise, so if you're not seeing it in the next sequence of the exercise, that doesn't necessarily mean companies haven't heard you. It's a matter of also taking the time to build those pipelines. One thing is, and I think this comes from the data point, you can measure what you have data on, is that there's a very strong focus on content risks. I think those risks are also quite extensively analyzed within these reports. There's also extensive discussions on how design and functionality act as controls, but there is somewhat limited, I would say, even though that differs between different reports, but there is somewhat less discussion on design and functionality related risks. So how certain design decisions or functionality decisions could create risks. And the one thing I would say that the reports actually do relatively well is, I remember back in like 2017, 2018, when we were working with companies under the EU Internet Forum and kind of writing in the beginning of writing the terrorist content online regulation, back when the DSA wasn't even kind of on the table or even a discussion point. We had a lot of problems speaking the same language with companies. We really struggled with that. And this is why the early legislative efforts in this space are kind of not that great, right? Because we didn't understand kind of the systems, how we function. And with these laws, one of the things which this allows us to do is also reduce that gap of understanding between the different entities and different parties. And these reports are an excellent source for that. So if you're a researcher, or I mean for regulators, absolutely as well, we see a lot of the investigations started on the basis of kind of, investigations into the risk assessment started on the basis of having received the first cohort of the risk assessments. But also for researchers, if you're a researcher and you want to research this topic, these reports are absolutely a great source of just understanding the vocabulary, what kind of questions to ask, what kind of questions to potentially pose, interview, etc. Okay. All right. Another area of audit reports. Let me try and do this quickly. Curtis will be excellent in kind of building on this, hopefully, and stop me if I say something too stupid. Okay. So 5 companies did audits. EY kind of took the market, but granted, they were auditing Meta and Alphabet companies, and that altogether I think is 7 VLOPs. So they got quite a bit of that market there. Then there's Deloitte, KPMG, and then there was only 2 auditors outside of the kind of big 4, big 6, or how do you want to call them? FDI Consulting and Holistic AI, who audited X and Wikimedia specifically. I'm not going to spend time on this slide. What I want to kind of zoom in is, for example, let's take one article of these 5 different auditors approaching the audit. I think most of the big 4 auditors approached it in a very similar way. I think you could also see that they had clearly talked to each other. There were certain sections of kind of the disclaimers and internal kind of risk-related statements which were very similar. This is something that the industry as a whole had clearly taken very seriously, of figuring out how can we actually give assurance in this space, right? So, and what is it that, how can we legitimately audit these companies, and mostly the law itself, right? Without very limited benchmarks in this space, without external standards. So there is some difference between these different approaches. The Commission gave out templates. In some cases, I think there's been some creativity in how to use them, so they did kind of limit the comparability, but I think that's a very, very small point. KPMG, EY, and Deloitte made an additional category in addition to the Commission template, which is partial compliance, which I actually really like, because the negative opinion under the Commission sort of delegated act and the proposal is really harsh. It basically means that even if you have a whole system in place, right, you have a notice and action mechanism as here is required, it works perfectly 360 days a week, days a year, and it's really perfect, everything works great. If it doesn't work for one day and the auditor finds it out, it's a negative, right? So it doesn't really give the correct picture. It kind of doesn't really allow for apples and apples to comparison of like a true negative versus something which overall has been complied with, but there have been some failures. So I'm actually quite partial to that. I think it's not a bad idea. We also found some interesting areas which alludes to the fact of how these audits kind of to think about. In order to do these audits, without any external benchmarks, the companies were basically asked to say, what's in scope, right? Like, what is it that is in scope of the audit? And I think maybe this is why we find this particular element there. So, for example, Article 16.1 says there's a notice and action mechanism that needs to be available to any user, right? So not any user, but any individual or entity, meaning that anyone, right? So it means that logged out users should also be able to use it. So in one case, for example, in the case of Amazon, they didn't have, they only had reporting for logged in users. And this was still a kind of a positive with comments. Amazon actually remedied that afterwards anyways. They added another kind of reporting mechanism to allow guests to also comment. So, and then at the same time for LinkedIn, because that reporting from guest users didn't work for a little bit, they got a negative or kind of a partial compliance, right? So that is also interesting, right? It's also a matter of kind of how do we understand this, and it's not super clear cut, even in these, which ultimately is a relatively clear cut obligation. You either have the system in place or you don't. And I think what's most interesting, and also you see this with Article 16.3, most auditors have said this is out of scope. Completely. Also, Holistic AI did say that it's out of scope. It's just they only gave audit results on the article level and not on the sub-article level. That's why it's one column there. But most said it's out of scope. Yeah, but FTI considered it was in scope for X, and they gave it a negative opinion, which was that's a worthwhile read in and of itself for legal scholars, I would suggest, in terms of just like an understanding of that rise to actual knowledge of illegality article. Okay, but then finally, it's Article 16 is also interesting from the perspective it has these like clear-cut requirements, right? You either send a confirmation to the users or the reporters, or you don't, right? This is clear-cut. The auditor can check it. You've done it or you haven't done it. You've put the process in place or you haven't. But how does the auditor check whether it's easy to access or user-friendly without any external benchmarks? The Commission also hasn't given benchmarks. The law doesn't really give benchmarks. I mean, the recitals allude to it, but not necessarily. So companies would have to come up with their own benchmarks, and the auditor can then measure the companies against those benchmarks. And so in most of these reports, you can find these benchmarks. These are benchmarks companies have come up with themselves. And the auditors have then assessed this. So, for example, easy to access, Amazon has given, I think, one of the clearest benchmarks, which is really interesting, which is 5 clicks away from any interface, is kind of their benchmark that they've used. For user-friendly, I think I need to get my notes now. I think for timely, which is also an interesting benchmark, it gives, so YouTube says 7 to 10 days. Wikimedia said 7 days in terms of timely of processing the report, right? And LinkedIn said 24 hours to something, depending on the type of content, right? And ultimately, what the recitals would kind of go with what LinkedIn has suggested as their benchmark, because the recitals actually speak of the importance of kind of looking at what type of content it is. Yeah, and so diligently, non-arbitrary and objective has usually been looked at by companies as just kind of alluding to their policies themselves, right? So that it follows the standard operating procedure that has been put in place. And interestingly enough, in one case, the auditor found that the company was not following its own standard operating procedure as it was written down. And I found this a particularly interesting conclusion, because of course this is something the company has put forward themselves, and the auditor has then found a partial non-compliance with it. And the management therefore has also kind of agreed, like, that this would be looked in and analyzed very, very concretely, right? So this is a really concrete example, what I could just find with one article, where this has driven change, right? because the auditor concluded, like, this is a very complex system that you're creating, and it's of course likely going to have some limitations because of the complexity of it. And this is a really interesting one, I find. So in terms of, we were looking for kind of positive ways of how this is driving change, or just ways of it driving change, then this is one of them. So I think maybe I will almost finish here. Let me just quickly check whether my notes say anything. So I think, as I said in the beginning, it does bring transparency. And it absolutely does bring accountability as well, because as we kind of, just one of these examples was that, right? There's accountability to at least your own internal processes. Are you following them? Are you not? And then that, of course, drives the kind of logic of if you're not following them, then maybe they're not good enough. So maybe they should be changed because they're too complex or they're not really fit for purpose. Yeah. Whether these things, whether the audits and the risk assessment actually drive change to protect users and society, that is something which I think remains to be seen. I think it's also too early to say that, because I don't think we have, and I don't know what the will be really say it, because I don't think we have a very good baseline to say that with, like, what do we measure back to, right? But I think it is certainly driving a lot of kind of change within the companies itself. Ultimately, I think where do we go from here is that feedback is key within these systems. So right now, so the auditors have given their feedback, which has its limitations, because the auditors can only give feedback to kind of the company's own benchmarks. And also to the law when it's kind of black and white requirements. But now the commission needs to come in and give their feedback. And as much as possible, if the kind of access to data requirements are finalized, then that type of feedback will also be important. So these systems drive on feedback. If nobody cares once these reports are published, then nothing's going to change, and these are going to ultimately be meaningless. So risk is subjective, and it requires a constant reconfiguration, and that requires feedback. I'm going to finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Agne. And last but not least, Curtis, the floor is yours. You have no slides, right? So.
No slides.
Okay.
Forgive me, no slides. I'm sure everybody's very upset. But great to be here. I'm Curtis. Everyone can hear me okay? Curtis Barnes. I think Martin summarized it quite well. I've seen, like, all sides of the picture, all layers of the onion, whatever analogy you want. I've worked with developing the methodologies to perform the audits, interfacing with the regulator on what's reasonable in terms of those audits, what they should reasonably expect to be possible, timeframes that are reasonable. I've worked with performing those audits or being part of teams, supporting those teams that are actually operationalizing them and executing them to produce the final opinions. And I've also worked with companies who are getting ready for audits, doing them. But if we step back from the audit picture, just trying to build a compliance framework, a framework of, we'll use this word controls, we'll come on to it a bit. Controls and governance for compliance, for a stronger, more robust compliance. So all sides of the picture. And it's very interesting to see it from all sides. I came to the UK about 3 years ago, and specifically for the purposes of working to start developing methodologies to perform these Digital Services Act audits, Digital Markets Act. The Online Safety Act also has audit functions within it. They're just not annual mandatory ones. They can be audited by regulators. And I sort of sat down with the teams that were building these practices going, okay, our audit clients, because most of the time you're going to be doing these audits for your financial audit clients because of independence reasons. You can't, a lot of firms don't consider they can do them for anyone else, because they do other kinds of work for them. So you're thinking these clients are inevitably going to come to us and they're going to say we need this done. you're our auditor, relying upon you to get it done, and so we need to be ready to do it. So we all sit down, partners and like experienced people who do audits and assurance in ESG spaces and human rights spaces, and we think we're going to nail this framework. We open it up, Article 14, terms and conditions, and we must have spent like 3 full 2-hour sessions going, so what the hell does plain and intelligible mean? Like, how are we going to measure this? Sorry, the expectation of, and then you go plain and intelligible, and you go, hang on a minute, there's reasonable, diligent, what's diligent mean? There's all of these different, squirrely little terms throughout the law, which I'm a lawyer by background as well, common in the law. You wouldn't root those out. They they serve a very important statutory function and an important role for the judiciary, an important role for a common law and all those things, to have those, to be able to develop a view of what those mean in different contexts. But they are a little bit like oil and water when it comes to the audit environment, because the audit environment, you're trying to squeeze out the ambiguity. So that was very immediately quite obvious that this is going to be a collision. So I'll probably pick on a few of the things which are probably less understood about the audit. Some of the things said today is really great, really helpful. But for them, probably I would say, we talk a lot about the reports. Talking about the reports for risk assessments, talking about the reports for audits is kind of like just the user interface on the phone. There's a lot going on behind it. And I think the more interesting, the more interesting in the reports is if I was a regulator, I'm looking at these requirements, not about the reports they create, but the fact they are a forcing function. They're a forcing function within companies to develop or improve or mobilize their governance functions. They're just the way they make decisions in new products, the way they make decisions about which risks they're willing to deal with, the way they organize themselves for the purposes of monitoring compliance. That's a big thing. We're coming, I'll say the C word again, controls. So when it comes to audit, again, there's going to be a lot of differences between the providers, but for the most part, what they want to do is they require, it's more than a want mostly, they require management of the company to give them a statement, written statement, and you'll find it in the audit reports, which says, we have provided you with a framework of controls, and that basically just means like measures and safeguards. Think of it like that. We have provided you with a framework of measures and safeguards that we consider are suitable or are enough, that we are reasonably confident. We have reasonable assurance that through this, we are compliant at any given moment. Not perfection, but it's not auditor walking into a dark room and like turning on their light and looking at random things, because that you're up against a natural epistemological problem here, that like the limits of knowledge. You will never be able to know everything in the company. So underpinning all of this is actually a statement which carries fraud risk, personal risk, by directors of companies that say you have been provided with a framework which we consider is suitable to comply with this law. Then there gets into questions, okay, so why do you think it's suitable? You would have to have gone, well, we have looked at individual requirements, we've not just looked at, law says we've got a water bottle, we've got a water bottle, great, job done. That's a bit facetious. Maybe use it, it says we need to have a feature that allows people to report illegal content. Sure, we've got the feature, but does it work? How do we know it works? These are very, very complicated companies. There's a lot of different products, different features. There's a lot of different, it's sort of like a Rubik's Cube, right? A Rubik's Cube of different surfaces, different layers of tech. You have to be quite confident that you have measures across and safeguards across all these different things that mean at any given moment you as management are quite confident that you're compliant with the law. But also that these are self-correcting things, because you think of controls, you go, okay, it's detective, preventive, and corrective. So if we start with preventative, we have controls that would actually prevent things from breaking and thus not being compliant. We have controls that would detect something's broken, or would miss something, or this doesn't work, this is a bad SOP, whatever it might be, that would detect that fact and then you would fix it. And that's the corrective part that really flows off the back of it. So auditors are coming in and they are usually, for the most part, receiving this statement, and then they're going, okay, we are going to audit the controls, and we are going to reach a conclusion on whether or not. So although the language of the law says, auditors, you tell us, are they compliant or not? That's obviously not really possible. You know, like you couldn't possibly, for one, it's an untested law. It's never even hit the courts yet. A lot of this stuff is completely unsettled. You know, it's just vapor right now. So the auditors are saying, okay, I'm going to look at this thing that management thinks is a good framework, suitable for reasonable assurance is the language. And I am going to assess each of these controls against sort of internal, like the risks relative to the law. And I am going to look at the design. Is it appropriately designed that it would support reasonable assurance is the language, reasonable assurance of compliance. And then I'm going to, if I find, okay, this is not appropriately designed, the story ends there to somewhat. I mean, like we start thinking, okay, is this in and of itself enough for you not to be complying with this article in the law, this requirement in the law? But if I go, yeah, it looks fine, Martin checks the system on a daily basis, and if he spots anomalies in the user reporting data that would indicate that the illegal content reporting has dropped in some way, he's going to take some action. That's his job. That's the control. I can see that, I've concluded that is appropriately designed and that it's implemented across all the surfaces. I'll come back to the Rubik's Cube in a second. Now I have to actually test the operational effectiveness, and I need to know that 365 days of the year, that control was working. I'm going to need so if Martin, that's a daily control, I should be able to see 365 records that was done. I'm going to take a sample from that. I'm going to give me, it'll depend on how risky I think the company is, how risky I think the obligation is. I'm going to say I want to see 40 days randomly selected. And if I find there's no evidence that it was done on some number of those days, now we're in the zone of, okay, is this material enough that I can say this control hasn't operated effectively throughout the year, such that I am no longer able to conclude that with reasonable assurance this company was compliant. Of course, you can also discover in this process actual instances of non-compliance, in the sense like you can discover, oh, it's not implemented for Surface X, or, and that's when, this is something I don't know the answer to at the moment. I would love to understand how the regulator feels about it. So I've used this analogy of the Rubik's Cube right now. It's Article 16, as Agne brought up, implements a functionality that allows users to report illegal content. So in any given company, for all content types, that's a question. For all content types, how many content types do you think are in any given social media platform? Who thinks the number is less than 10? Who thinks the number is more than, I don't know where I'm going with this. You get the point, there's lots. So somebody, it's just a question. The reasonableness and proportionality appears in the risk assessment thing. You've got reasonable, proportion, and effective measures. How does that map back to Article 16? I don't know. For instance, that's something I would like to understand better. So we've got short videos, we've got long videos, we've got live streams, we've got photos, we've got photo carousels, we've got sounds, we've got music, we've got stickers, we've got emojis, we've got story things that pop up, we've got notes that you can add, and it just goes down and down and down and down into the 80th degree of things, and it's unclear where you should draw the line. And it comes to audit, and I think it's quite difficult to have an auditor turning up and saying, you tell me the scope, which of these need to be compliant with the law, and you're like, well, the law just said all content types, so it's sort of like you give me enough rope to hang myself here, basically, to say, but in reality, it's probably, how many people are using feature, 76. How much risk does that particular type of content carry? I don't understand the relationship personally between those nuances and, say, the way that the risk assessment or the mitigation requirements are framed. I think I would like to understand that more. The same goes for the ways you gain access to the app. So if that's like, you're like, okay, 80 dimensions to the Rubik's Cube, here's another, it's starting to get, like, it's like orders of magnitude, right? So you've got, we'd all accept Android, Android and iOS, obviously, mobile app. You've got web app, okay, web app. Web app logged out, okay, yeah. Then you've got, you can watch it on TV. You can watch it on your smart fridge. You can watch it on an airplane. You can watch it in your car. You can watch it on a gym machine. All of these are surfaces where you might be able to consume the content. And you then can go, gosh, so these as well? Like, are these also, does the requirement of the law also extend to these examples? Open question, I'm not sure. But it's hard, I've heard it described by one counsel at a platform as the most painful thing they've ever been through as a lawyer. Was the DSA audits. Because of these kinds of oil and water questions, if you got unstoppable force and immovable object of auditors and lawyers and companies and sort of going, sure, but give me all the things that it's implemented for and give me all the content types and give me all the services that the content type is available on and tell me, give me all the matrix of all of these things. And we are all operating in a vacuum of information. The regulator seems to think that's a good thing. I guess, I've heard someone from civil society say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? We'll pick the ones we like, you know what I mean? And then we'll give guidance or something like that. But when you're going through a first of its kind, extremely expensive, extremely time-consuming and deep audit and all this stuff, and you're also building systems that cost millions and millions of dollars, not only to build them, but then to monitor them, because I come back to the controls question. It's not enough to just say, okay, we implemented it on TV app, We're also expected to be monitoring whether it keeps working on T-app, whether it drops, things like that. It starts to get very big very quickly, as you can probably imagine. And it makes it hard for the auditors as well, because it's sort of like you might not know the right questions to ask, to elicit all this detail. And the platforms, the companies might not have known it's information you might have even wanted to know, because it's fairly obscure, some of it. Now, I'm talking about the hard parts. There's a lot of really good, there's a huge amount of good, I think, comes out of the audits. And I've heard, audit partners at firms, not only for self-interested reasons, but also from an actual perspective, saying to the regulator, this is really good. You should add these audit requirements to more laws. And I agree, because it is a forcing function to drive governance, monitoring, structure on the information environment, clear decision-making, clear accountability, and then it's all topped off by that statement I said at the beginning, that statement of I think this is enough. Somebody signs that, a human signs that, I think this is enough. And OSA gets even more acute, because they have section 202, I can't recall, but they have corporate officers' personal criminal liability for negligence. So who has an idea of how you don't be negligent if you're a corporate officer over this scale of stuff? I have an idea, and the idea comes back to this concept of rigorous controls, rigorous monitoring, rigorous reporting, rigorous self-correction internally. So I would almost say, don't get too sucked in by the reports. Think about what needs to exist for those reports to not be vapor. And the same for the risk assessments. If progressively that pushes questions that might not have been asked into decision-making processes and people to seek second opinions within their own company, improve accountability. I think it's a really powerful thing, even though it's very complicated. And we can all sit around sort of going, what does systemic mean? And what is it's very difficult. But ultimately, the one common thread is you can't do any of this without mature governance, internal controls, monitoring, mobilizing all layers of the business. And we talk about this concept in, business talk about the 3 lines of defense. Lawyers have never heard of this. Most of the lawyers have never heard. Anyone heard of the 3 lines of defense? Okay, so in a company, the 3 lines of defense. Sorry if I should just stop and we should move on, but I think this is important. This has all come out of financial services meltdowns, the original systemic catastrophes, right? You know what I mean? Is that it's everyone's responsibility at different levels of the business to whether it's do the right thing or be compliant with laws or follow company policy or process, whatever it is. The first line is the business itself. So in companies, we might be talking about the people that develop products, the people that, there's all sorts of things, the people that run, enable advertising to occur, people that do sales. So all of these people, they are the first protocol, and they own those things are called controls. They own them. They are required to be doing them. And in mature regulated industries, if you do not perform your controls, you're in a big trouble. Big trouble. Then you've got a second line, which is made up of, it still reports into management, but it's made up of people who are interested in risk. The risk of the company. How should we measure it? What's the tolerable levels? How should we advise people about when they just need to stop? The controls must be implemented here. You are over the line, things like that. And then compliance people like myself and others who monitor across all of this and tell senior management, this framework is not fit for purpose. Or this is a pretty good framework. It's got some weaknesses. We've got a lot of inputs here. But for the most part, it's good. We've got hotspots, stuff like that. That's the second line. And then the third line is internal audit. Every big regulated company has a big internal audit function. And they are outside management. They report directly into the board, basically, or the CFO or something. And they in their own company, are auditing you. I mean, who would know that we're doing external audits? All of these companies, I'm confident, have had numerous internal audits of DSA compliance and will be finding problems, and a lot of new people will be meeting internal auditors for the first time in these companies, and going, sorry, who are you? And why do I have to do what you say? You know what I mean? It's like, you don't, but the point is, don't outsource getting comfortable with your compliance to your external auditor. That's why we're here to help you. And then the fourth line of defense, which I buried, is actually the external auditors. Because the goal of all of this is not to find company. Look, I don't know the hearts and minds of the regulators. The goal is not to find companies and punish them through audits. Really, that wouldn't be the way you would think about it in other industries. You would say this is the last line of defense to stop the bleeding. To stop the bleeding and self-correct before enforcement comes. They're never going to be your friends, but this process is meant to produce recommendations that help you. You think I'm the enemy, but I'm here to help. Ultimately, I'm here to help you because I found out X doesn't work when you had missed it. And that could have gone on for years without you knowing. And now I'm recommending ways you should fix it. And I think we got a useful glimpse into the mind of the regulator because they haven't said much, but they did put out a press statement where they said the great part of the audits are working because we can see the platforms are self-correcting. Because in response to all the recommendations that auditors gave, platforms also had to publish what's called the implementation report, where they said whether they would reject the recommendation, accept the recommendation, reject it but do something else, whatever it is, and that had to go directly to the regulator as well. And vast majority of platforms were like, yep, we'll fix it. So I think the regulator must look at that and go, that's great. And they haven't come down like a ton of bricks on platforms because things were wrong. So I probably could go on for a while, but I'm going to draw a line there, and I'm sure questions will elicit all sorts of interesting insights and different things that I haven't thought of either.
Excellent. Thank you, Curtis. Wonderful. I noted tons of questions, and I'm sure you also have questions for your colleagues here on the panel. So what I will do, I'll post a couple of questions that I collected. Some of them coincide with I see online, but and so after initial sort of a few questions from me, I would then open the room here. And of course, online people can post them as they go. Okay, so one thing that I think sort of I found interesting, and people online remarked on it, but also it was mentioned, I think, by both of you, Agne and Curtis, was this kind of a observation. So Agne said, well, it seems that most of the audit has focused more on the content than on the feature design side. And related to that, Curtis, you said, for auditors, it's much more difficult to audit the actual implementation than it is to audit the monitoring. That's a little bit free way of rephrasing what you said, but that's kind of how I understood it. So are the two related somehow, or what's the kind of reason for both? Because I could see them related, that design things are just so difficult to audit then later down the road. I could see how they do them in risk assessment. Doesn't necessarily, explain that part, but I could see that if you think about risk assessment as a performance that you do for the auditor, then of course you would neglect the thing that auditor might be the least capable of sort of observing, because they would be much more interested in monitoring. And just to be clear, what I mean by that, when Curtis said, we're going to look at whether Martin is there for 365 days, that's the monitoring part, because the implementation part is that we have an interface and there's someone who can review if there's a potential problem. And I can see how it's easy to document whether someone was actually checking that implementation. But of course, for the regulator, the key role will be to check the implementation. I mean, it's very helpful to have someone to check was this the case for the whole year? So that's a huge added value, because no regulator can check companies for the whole year. But of course, on the compliance issues, they will be interested in implementation. So I'm not sure I'm good, I sort of phrased this well, but I'm really interested. Are they two related? And if not, why do we see these two things sort of in the first exercises that we saw?
I just want to make sure I understand. So when you say implementation, what does that mean to you?
It's like, well, I designed an interface for these specific pieces of content. It's going to look like this. You have to type in all this information to be able to submit a notice, for instance, right? And then the monitoring would be checking whether it has been properly processed, it has been attended to for the whole period, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, some of that can be approached from a controls perspective. So if we take it, like, let's try and pick a DSA example so I can talk around it. Like, we're saying whether or not the reporting function is easy to access, easy to use, as might be required by the law. So the world at large might be thinking auditors are going to go in and they're going to be the arbiter of whether it's easy to access or not. And sometimes they are. Sometimes I'll come to that in a moment. Sometimes you have to be. You're left with no other choice, right? And different audit providers will have had different willingness to go there, or some might just down tools if your controls failed it. But first you'd start with the controls and you'd go, okay, well, what is the benchmark, as Agnes said? We don't have one. That's not a good sign. That's difficult. That's going to be a difficult starting point. So probably you'll say, we need you to come up with one now. Like if you have, or you need to furnish one at least. You won't say come up with them now, but furnish one to us. And then how did you settle upon that particular one? And then you would like to see controls around. So if we framed as a risk, the risk that the risk that our design was actually not accessible. What did you do to manage that? What did you do at the time? What might you do on an ongoing basis if you think it's an ongoing risk? And then most companies are going to be able to say, well, you'll find a product requirement document or something where we have worked between designers and counsel for a very long time to discuss the design of this. That's functionally a control, right? So you could start looking there. There's going to be things. There's always going to be something. Others might say, and we also put it to a special committee in the company, and they reviewed it and they signed off on it, or they made recommendations and things like that. So you would try to use the controls insofar as possible, if it's possible to do so. But there are scenarios where you do have to do what you sometimes frame as substantive testing, you know. But even then, the auditor tries to kind of like construct a control their own control and test against it. You know what I mean? But there are, across all reports, to greater or lesser degree, I'm sure you will find plenty of instances where auditors were willing to stick their neck out and say, look, I just really don't think that's a realistic perspective. Or more likely they find some way to give the negative, because it's sort of like, actually turns out you said 5 clicks, but we found that on product feature X on user interface, it was 8. So like, that's our get out of jail free card, frankly. You'll give you your finding, you know what I mean?
It's definitely variable, right? And I mean, I understand the tendency. I guess one example we discuss is 14.4, sort of fundamental rights compliance of your terms and conditions, which is extremely difficult to audit, right? What do? Do you like check every single clause and every single provision and terms and conditions? And so the answer that some of the auditors came up with was essentially, well, if you have essentially thought about the risks more broadly on the platform, surely the deliberation led to a policy that is sufficiently well balanced and it complies with the 14.4, which clearly is a possible way how to audit it, but clearly for a regulator or for courts, that's like miles away from what they will be thinking about when they look at the clause, which I think it's fair as well to recognize that auditors' role in some sense, in absence of further clarification by courts and regulators, it's much more limited and maybe remains a little bit more sort of governance-linked sort of controls. There are much more governance and monitoring linked than sort of being at the frontier of pushing the substance, right? We think 14.4 means this, and you need to change this clause because, I don't know, termination of accounts after 3 strikes is too harsh or something like that, right? And about the design, what about this point about the design? That's the other thing that came up. Also was mentioned online. The fact that design and functionalities are perhaps less in the purview of the audits. Like, do you see an explanation for that? Is it just because, well, you first do the most important stuff to sort of comply with the law, which is obviously everyone is worried about content, or is there a reason?
It's less of the purview of the risk assessments, I would say.
Okay.
And in terms of, to the extent that we see the audits on the risk assessments, because in many cases auditors did not take an opinion on it. So all of the big 4 auditors concluded that they're not going to take an opinion on ongoing investigations, not because they don't want to, or simply because what they concluded was because they don't have access to the material from the investigation, meaning that they have knowledge of material that they cannot have access to, which has very likely a material impact on the potential audit conclusion of it, meaning that they cannot then therefore take an opinion on it, which was, I found an interesting kind of way of putting it. Only FTI did take an opinion on X for areas where they are under investigation as well. But you can also see there, because the DSA's audit benchmark is the delegated act, you can see the difference between, because I think their background was mostly information systems, and they reference in their audit as well, that was the standard that they were relying upon, versus others were relying upon on other standards, which are and they were all relying on the same standards, right? So you can see that potentially that is where the difference comes from, but the Delegated Act does kind of welcome in principle that, right? Just because we only had 2 auditors from that specific, so it's going to be interesting what the Commission then does with that, right? Where are they going to say a bit more to, where should the different approaches rely? What is then the role of the auditors? But I think aside from that, in terms of, even if you then have, I think the auditor is not the one for Article 34, so Article on Risk Assessments. It's not the role of the auditor to say what is good enough in that particular instance. I think the auditor, the only thing they can do is look at what the company has and whether or not the company has met their own internal structure of how they've set it up. Because Article 34 is so full of areas which are ambiguous, areas which require a lot of additions in terms of substance, right? What does all of this mean? So it's not the, I would assume, and Curtis, correct me from, I don't, like, from my perspective, it's also not the role of the auditor to come in and say, well, you need to also audit that piece of content because, you know, DSA recital said it, right? That's not, it's not, right? So I think when we're looking at that risk assessments and the audits together, there's really, for the moment, I think this is really an area where we need further input for this to kind of develop or this to change, or companies to really look at it from a new perspective, and from some maybe a more uniform perspective. This requires input from the regulator and any other kind of party that can really give input to it about what do we really want to see, what would be more meaningful in this particular context.
Lorna, do you have any observations on that question or on the debate?
I suppose, sort of taking it to a more general level, there is a focus on content in a lot of the political debates. And I just wonder if some of it, part of the focus is following that fact that, you know, particularly politicians, when they're talking about something, are always talking about an item of content, and they're usually talking about why hasn't this come down. You know, it's the obvious, it's the thing you see quite literally. And I think going behind that into questions of design and also the way different features interact.
It's new.
Yeah.
I think I think what you're alluding to is really, really good, and just building upon that. It's true. So since kind of 2015, what we've been demanding of companies is like, give us, how much are you taking down? Take down more content, right? Like from when we were speaking of kind of the online terrorist content piece was exactly kind of related to that, right? And show us the statistics. What are you actually taking down? What are you removing? How fast are you doing it? So we've developed, and companies in response to this have developed metrics to measure this, and transparency reports. And now the DSA actually tells them, hey, but you also need to look at your design and functionality and how the combination of those risks, how in combination of these different functionalities, risks can arise. And that is new. And so it's completely, I think it's completely understandable that there is a significant focus on content-related risks, because those risks are not necessarily risks where we have measures and frameworks which are agreed upon to measure them through. And I think actually, well, Ofcom actually has done quite a bit of work of looking at what features and design functionalities could create risks. So that is one area where potentially there is some kind of things to build upon it. But what we do see in these reports, and I find that interesting, is that controls where they, like functionalities where they act as controls, are very much discussed by the company. So of course these are, but just, I mean, and I gotta also be frank, I mean, in a public report, I think it's also a very difficult thing for a company to write, right? Like, I have looked at these functionalities of my service and they create a significant risk for mental health. Like that is also a very complicated sentence in principle to write, and companies do allude to it, but in a very kind of one sentence, and then they go to discuss the risks. And that's also a question of who are these reports for and what should we be demanding from these reports, right? Because ultimately what you'd want is that internally these companies would be having extremely strategic discussions on the management level about these risks. But is it necessary that I mean, also in the financial world, you're not going to see that level of kind of, admittance to risks on a public report, right? But so how do we kind of achieve that? How do we achieve transparency around it, but at the same time, that the fact that it actually moves the needle, that things get safer, that there is more considerations of the actual risks, kind of to users, actual kind of societal risks within these companies, and what is it that we should kind of demand? Because I don't think that's actually obvious. Like demanding like deep analysis of how a feature may have risks and demanding a company to publish that, I'm not sure whether that is actually where the kind of what will move the needle there.
So I guess, please.
Sorry. It's sort of following on from the new point and the design point, is how fundamentally you want companies to review what they're doing. Because in a way, content is constantly changing, and it's easy to, if you like, update the snapshot. But if you're looking at a service and wanting it to assess fundamental features of its product offering, you may be actually, in business terms, making a big ask, but just in terms of documentation and risk assessment and all that process stuff, it mightn't have been there or to the degree required when the feature was brought in. So what do? Do you want some retrofitting? Do you want some, this is how we change it now going forward, or what?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the further problem is that, so there's one thing to describe the risks in abstract, right? Okay, on social media, there's a lot of CSAM, if you're this kind of idea of the risk profiles. But then every single social media with its different features will have very different risk profile depending on whether you can have direct messaging or not, depending on who can direct message to, etc. And I think one area where actually the feature testing plus this kind of specific focus really is forced is the ad hoc risk assessment outside of the annual cycle before the launch of new features that have critical impact on the risks identified in the risk assessment from the last year. So kind of what you're saying, Lorna, is like, maybe it's understandable, if I hear you, maybe it's understandable for the big annual risk assessments, but then given the ad hoc assessments that they have to do for the new features going forward, that will be a very different deal. Sort of past, we don't necessarily do the sort of inventory, that's the part of the baseline. But now going forward, if you introduce new features and I guess subtract existing features, that's the question where a separate risk assessment for new features that can have critical impact can arise, which obviously we already have some thinking on from the Commission. I think it should be widely discussed whether that's the trade-offs of that thinking. But isn't that a way to channel that in, at least going forward?
Well, from my from my perspective, absolutely, right. But I think what we've seen this content versus design features criticism also from coming in from some researchers. I think what's maybe missing for the moment, at least in the public reports, right? I can't attest to the fact whether this was internally done in-house or comment to the fact to what extent that was done. And I think it definitely was to different layers and degrees, and I think the OSA also demands a greater focus on the kind of features and functionality, so that will also come by kind of complying with other laws. But I think the DSA, the first risk assessment, would almost assume that you've done that level of assessment for all the features that are already present, and then anything that you would add would kind of come on top of that. But I'm not entirely sure whether that was the baseline that everyone started from, because just the kind of obligation, it has a lot in it, right? So how you structure the analysis, how do you come up with the correct methodology for the very first time for something that's never done before? So I think this is a matter of thinking, okay, what is it that we would actually need? And maybe the Commission there coming out, because they would have seen all the reports, right? And they would have been able to ask also access to the non-public versions of those. So because what we're seeing here are summaries of these reports. Of course, companies would have a lot more documentation in-house on kind of discussing exactly the things that were done. But ultimately, I think that was kind of the thing, and I'm not sure whether that is actually something that has
fully been done, or it's something that potentially could have a deeper analysis on. But you can see some companies did do a feature analysis, like what is in scope, what is not in scope. So you will see in some risk assessments that does exist. And for example, some services have excluded messaging as part of that feature list, right? Because they excluded on the basis of, which is also kind of defensible under the DSA, messaging is not an online platform. That is explicitly said that private messaging is not part of an online platform. But then is it not still a feature of a VLOP? And this is something where also I think the Commission needs to give further clarity to the VLOPs, because they have taken what I would argue that legally you can defend both positions in principle. And again, this is kind of the place where I think the DSA is a strong law in many ways, but we're seeing as we're going through implementation, and that's going to come more and more, the need for further decisions by someone on what is kind of right and what could be improved on, and that's going to have to come from a regulator or a court,
I don't think it would be an unreasonable argument to say that it was a tactical misstep by the legislature to frame those risk assessment requirements as fundamentally about producing a report, right? That was a decision which they other alternatives could have been made. It's a big Charlie Munger moment of show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. It's because now you're hearing there's too much stuff. It's a big report. It's full of information. It's like, I want to see it in operation. I want to see this is really meant to be about the way you run your business. So why wasn't this a requirement to put in place a risk management system with specific requirements to say report to the board of directors on a monthly basis internally, setting out blah blah blah. Why was this not? Why did they go down this route? And I think there's probably arguments they would say, well, it fits with the transparency regime they were imagining, in that civil society or academics or anyone else would be able to look at these and maybe provide a sort of third, fourth estate type perspective on these. But I think it'll be interesting to say look at the AI Act, which has a requirement to put in place a risk management system, not produce a public report about AI systems, but have an operational thing you would expect mature regulated companies to have, reporting into the internal governance structures, records of decision making, minutes of meetings, who said what, who made what call, discussed all the time. That might have produced different outcomes. So I actually think it's easier and better for a company to look at 34 and 35, stop talking about risk assessments and just start talking about a risk management system. Because really those relate to each other. Actually, the only reason anyone ought to care about any of this is if this would lead you to make a decision you weren't otherwise going to make. Right? That's the only reason you would care. Does this thing you did lead you to do something that you didn't think of before, didn't want to do? And that's in the form of 35, and it's really, we decided actually this could be improved, this product could be changed, as a result of this. And framing it on this, and to make matters worse, the annual basis, that only amplifies the problem of, I think I am probably, I don't know the hearts and minds of the regulator, but I bet what they wanted was year-round, not to say platforms or companies aren't doing this, just so you know, not to say that this is not the way they're approaching it, but I'm sure what the regulator wants is a year-round, everyday process of risk management in the product development and policy development process. That's what they want. And then this annual reporting requirement is kind of like it's a little bit of a white elephant in that thing, because you take a snapshot of time. Also, if you're doing this operationally, some of these features you're going to look at in February, and you're going to write the public report in, whatever it is, July. And so, because you can't look at everything all at once, if we're supposed to do everything right in the lead up to the reporting function, relook at it again, you're only going to get skin deep on everything. It has to be done throughout a year, a constant process of looking and doing and looking and doing. So I think it's an interesting reflection, which I wonder how the regulator feels in light of what they've got. No, they do have access to all the supporting docs.
So with that, you think that OSA can produce, since it's not as public, can produce different type of dynamic in terms of the management of risks?
I think it can. Again, coming back to what I think the emphasis is on governance and decision-making and accountability for those kinds of decisions. It's really, how does this roll up into the way the company makes decisions? You know, does it form part of, does it exist on an island, or does it form part of the fabric of the company? I'm sure that Ofcom are hopeful, and I know they've made public statements to this effect. They want this to be a reflection of the fundamentally the way the company makes decisions.
They have put obligations in the code of practice about, I mean, sort of it is quite high level, so you know there are going to be questions about how each company do this. There are some governance requirements in there about, you know, sort of particular individuals with responsibility, oversight systems within a company. So, and that's come in from what Ofcom's put in from the terms of the Act.
So there can be interesting cross-fertilization there, also with the OSA's emphasis on features more than the DSA, really. So another question, that probably my last question, that I open it to questions in the room, that came from the online participants, but also something that I thought it was interesting in what Lorna said, or that's kind of eternal question almost, which is kind of a double question of, one, what is systemic, and what is it meant to be? Is it really a qualitative threshold of any kind, or is it really just, it relates to systems, that's it? If we are looking at risks related to content, how are we making sure that we're not regulating the content through the process rules, right? Do you have any views on that?
Well, I cringe when I hear the word systemic, because I think I used the phrase myself once upon a time, back in about 2016, and I was thinking about system, not content, but also that the company should have a system for risk management, and systemic, just isolated like that, is capable of bearing those meanings. But then when you start hooking it up to systemic risk, then it seems to get completely different overtones. I suppose my preference is to say, well, we should be focusing on, I suppose, this risk management approach, rather than hooking into, you know, what are these big content risks? I've obviously lost the argument on that one, because everybody loves to talk about types of content. And I think it is a real, well, it is difficult, because the way a lot of the problems manifest themselves is through what people post online, which turns into content. So it is hard to make the distinction. But I think the more you focus on metrics around content, the more you focus on talking about takedown in particular, the more you slip into that content terrain. I think we're probably on a sliding scale rather than, you know, sort of separate boxes.
I think the regulator does feel the same way. Like, if you look at some of the enforcement action around, or the questions they are asking, they are looking at, you know, here's something which is fundamentally not about content. How are people using the service too much? Like, that is a question which I think is not this is content related, because if you've got an incredibly good product that people don't want to stop using it, it's probably because the content is really good. So there is a relationship, but I think they're definitely looking for a broader view of the kinds of subject matter for those risk assessments and the kind of harms that they're looking at.
So the typical concern that I hear is that because the DSA mentions adopting or adapting the terms and conditions among the measures and the risk mitigation, the argument sort of goes, well, suppose a certain company, I can't even say company X, company Z. Company Z has a product and they have a certain policy and they prohibit certain type of content that is actually lawful, but they just say we don't want it in a platform. Then they remove that clause. Another question becomes, well, could the regulator come in and try to force them to reintroduce some sort of contractual restriction on something that is otherwise problematic? And I have a view on that that is not possible, and I agree that the way the regulator conducts itself so far is in line with that, not necessarily all the PR of the regulator. But I think that's the kind of a key concern where people get really triggered, is that, well, adopting terms and conditions doesn't mean that we could now, and it's, if you look at what is happening with some companies at the moment, rolling back certain policies. Of course, in Europe, many of them would be backed by law that actually says this content is illegal, so we don't have the same problem. But I think that's kind of the thinking, right? And disinformation is the litmus test often for these things, because a lot of disinformation is not necessary. How about the qualitativeness in the systemic, right? So you're now skeptical that there's any qualitative threshold, but do you think there is any? Because there are people out there, for a good reason, they're worried about that. So there's one thing to use the term systemic for the purposes of the risk assessments, but there's another where I think people are really worried about it, which is for researchers, because their access to data is limited to what is systemic risk. So while it's all nice and well that the companies can be overbroad in the way they assess things, including non-systemic, whatever the stick yard is, the yardstick is, but the problem is for researchers is that if the other side can make the argument, well, this is not actually systemic, then they lose access to data. So is that something that you think needs to be fleshed out as a result, or we should have, how should we approach it? Because we need to operationalize in some way, and risk assessment is not the only place where we need to operationalize it.
That's a really interesting thought. I hadn't thought about the way those interpretations could be used to curate what access you give. I haven't seen in any of the ways, and again, I don't have omnipotent knowledge of them by any means, but I haven't seen any of them cleave to this idea that systemic can be used as a threshold by which to eliminate risks. Yeah. And I think partly you can understand why, because it immediately wouldn't wash if you turned up to the regulator and said, the language of the law said that we really need to care about mental well-being, but we've just determined that there is no, the systemic threshold of our platform to have an impact on mental well-being is so absurd. The idea that we could, at a systemic level, influence Europe's mental well-being. Yeah. So basically, we've just drawn a line through that risk, and we're not doing that assessment. That would not fly. Speaking for myself, I basically just, you take Control F in the law, in my own Excel. I search systemic risk and I just replace all with important, really important. In fact, I don't even need to do that. I would just say the point is the regulator told you what risks to care about. Yeah. So the systemic risks are the ones that they told you to care. That just meant. I think the only reason really it is in there is because they really, really wanted to press home the point that this is not about corporate risk, commercial risk, internal risk, which is what most companies in any industry are mostly focused on, is risk to ourselves. I think they could have picked better words, but my guess is they put that word in there to press home the point. This is externally facing. Users and society generally are the subject of these risk assessments.
Well, the original proposal had significant systemic risk, if I recall this correctly.
Yeah.
Agne, you would also know.
But also why systemic, right? It's also about not being content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was one of the very key elements of it, right? We're looking at systemic things. Yeah. We're not looking at individual pieces of content, because when we speak outside of dissemination of illegal content, where also I think the Commission doesn't zero tolerance isn't the name of the game there, right? There's an understanding that where companies would deploy measures, those same measures could suppress free speech to an extent which is unacceptable, right? So if you're de-risking for terrorism, you could potentially say, well, no content in a particular language then, right? You ban an entire language, which would be absurd. So of course, this is the kind of systemic part to it. But I've also heard these discussions, and from my perspective, yeah, I understand like Curtis does, right?
No,
Regulators
I think we are in agreement here, but there's a lot of people who are not in agreement with that reading. So I think it's.
I did wonder. Do you remember a paper? It wasn't published by the Commission, but it came out around Russian.
The Russian report, yes.
And that made a lot of hay, or put a lot of stock in this idea of there being some kind of systemic level threshold.
Exactly.
And regulating
that should be measuring. Has a risk, that was in the, has it gone into the grey zone? Has it gone over the threshold now? But I don't think it was ever. It was an interesting fact that was published. I don't understand the.
But it was published as a commission research, even though it was commissioned research, and it's not commission's own research.
Yeah.
Anyway, we need to open it to the audience. So, any questions from the audience here? There's a couple of there online, but you have priority here. Yes.
It's more about the audit and the risk assessment, but are we not at risk of completely missing the point of it here? And what I mean by that is, generally speaking with law, we're looking at an intent and we're looking at an outcome. So controls, yes, they're great measurables at ensuring an outcome remains in place, but they're not proof that an outcome has happened necessarily. So if a control hasn't happened on a given day, that doesn't mean the outcome is not still in place. So are auditors at risk of putting so much focus and administrative burden on businesses and maybe creating negatives where actually the outcome's always been achieved?
Well, I think an auditor might say in that case, let's open to the platform to say controls aren't needed here because there's no historic risk. Like you.
We found across the auditors as well that I think even within Deloitte yourself, Deloitte took different approaches to the necessity of IT controls in particular, where Deloitte generally found that actually did not need IT controls in order to get the positives, but wider Deloitte felt that actually, unless you had IT controls in place, they weren't willing to give positive results.
Yeah, and for those who, so IT controls, which I didn't get onto before, is basically all these, a lot of compliance with these requirements, a lot of it depends upon the continued effective functioning of IT systems. There are concepts like general IT controls, which would give you an indication you can rely upon the continued effectiveness of that system. So access management, or if it's data flowing from one system to another, interface monitoring, so you would identify if some data was getting lost. And that becomes very relevant when you think, well, I need to know if all the user reports got processed. I would need to know that there is no potential for that some of that data never made it through to the queue, that never got moderated, got lost, that report got lost. On the matter of differences between reports, I think it's challenging because everything proceeds first and foremost from a perspective of an audit risk assessment. An audit risk assessment which takes account of all sorts of things, but it might look at the inherent riskiness of the platform itself and things like that, and it might make decisions fundamentally about what it expects to see, whether it be controls or anything else, based upon its risk assessment of that particular platform. And so it's impossible in the abstract to know why certain decisions were made across different providers. That's a limitation I think public users of the report will always have, or at least for now will have, because those audit risk assessments are not part of public reporting. Yeah. I feel like your question was far more profound than my answer, though.
Detach between with law and outcomes, and it's trying to prevent the risk and a focus on controls, we can kind of potentially get distracted in, we're all looking to build all these controls, but actually the focus would be the outcome.
Outcome being, were we compliant? you'll hear a lot of platforms saying that, I'm sure. You know, you're talking about controls, but, you know, point is, it was there. I think it's really because how could otherwise, it's very difficult for an auditor to know that you're compliant. It's not really about knowing, again, no, it's not perfect. It's reasonable assurance is the standard, which is a high standard, but reasonable assurance of compliance. So if a platform could go, we absolutely were compliant, doesn't matter about the controls, and we can produce a screenshot of the system available every single day for 365 days of the year for all users in the world across all, then sure, at that point you would know. But without that, which is obviously impossible, what you're saying is, if they're compliant, surely the controls don't matter. But how will you know they're compliant when you think of all of those different dimensions of the Rubik's Cube that I were talking about? There's just no way of an auditor certainly would ever know. It's quite difficult for a platform to know, if not impossible.
I think this is possibly what some of the wider panelists were saying as well, though, is everyone that is being audited for the first time this year, all of these businesses come from what would have been an unregulated industry, and overnight they've turned into a regulated industry. And so controls are, by necessity, a journey.
Yeah.
And it's been retrospective.
So almost all the big, I'll hand to you in a moment, Agne, but almost all, and I was one of them who wrote the public submissions, of the big audit providers in their public submissions said it's too early for this type of audit. It's a long journey. It's a long journey. Why not take incremental steps to get there? And I think it is interesting that the Commission for, say, CSRD, and that has an assurance requirement. The European Commission said, until there are standards, yes, there's going to be an audit. When I say assurance, I'm really meaning audit. Yes, there's going to be an audit, but it's going to be to a limited assurance standard, which does not solve all problems, but it does lower the bar. And they said, until there are, and when it's standards, then it will ramp up. So that was the feedback, is you're setting this up to be very, very difficult, and you might get a lot of results, which are basically reflections of companies not having enough time. Not enough time to get this framework in place. Because from the time the law was finalized was December 2022. The audit period began on DSA day one, which was, for most platforms, August 25th. It usually takes years to build this kind of framework in any meaningful way. So that's been a problem that all parties have been fighting from the start. The only party that has not seemed interested is the regulator.
I think maybe just one comment on that. So yes, I fully agree. I think companies are really struggling coming from a completely unregulated space, right? So are really struggling to kind of keep up with this, right? And now they built something up very artisanal quickly in the first 4 months since they were designated, because of course getting also internal like inputs to this, right? Like getting people to give you funding only comes when you get an official designation. You're not going to set up an entire department, right? Or I mean, many of them did, who knew that this is going to come away. They started preparing, but even, you know, really going into it, and they had to do a risk assessment and set out all of the obligations, actually implement them, and then to build an entire monitoring program on top of that. I mean, it was a very, very quick thing, and of course, many of them now. And a lot of what Curtis has been saying, we are seeing this with a lot of the companies that we work with. Many of them now have to kind of rebuild their operating model for risks, controls, their entire governance mechanisms in-house, because what they built isn't functioning and it's very painful. It's just painful. It's painful to do the risk assessments. It's painful to do the audits, because it really requires a good setup for this to flow, and the auditors come with a very high assurance standard. But when I was looking at this, just from a kind of one reflection from a user perspective, right? So some of these, especially Article 16, which is user facing, right? So users, whether or not users can have a reporting form or an access to it, right? And I think there's so much value in having a third-party evaluator for these types of things, and especially also looking at whether or not it functions throughout the year. So not whether it functioned for the 4 weeks the auditor was there, or 4 weeks, whatever kind of, you know, anyone was looking, but whether it functioned for a year, because users in this particular space, and this is ultimately what was also the purpose of the DSA, is to give and rebalance those rights, right? Because users have in case the form isn't working, how quickly would a regulator find out about it? It would probably take a long time, then it would take a while to actually investigate that, and then it would take a while to fine it. And at all of that time, users are having an ineffectual kind of rights relationship with the platform. And I think this is where, and we're also seeing as a response to these audits and these audit implementation reports, to the best of how everyone managed to do this, right? Both the auditors who were dealing with a very high level of uncertainty and the platforms that were also dealing with a high level of uncertainty. There is a lot of, okay, we'll fix this. All right, we'll do this. And I think there is, from that perspective, even though maybe it's unnecessarily painful in some instances, but there is a truth to the fact that I think the regulation is so painful because it came so late to the party. Like we've experienced the tech environment, which has gone completely unregulated for too long. And so I think, and maybe that was kind of the logic of the regulator at the time. I wasn't there anymore, so I can't really speak to that anymore. But maybe that was that, right? Like, we don't have time in this space to wait, like, for...
I think that definitely was the logic.
Like also politically, right? Like, we can't come out politically with something. We need you guys need to go from 0 to 100 in like 3 seconds, and we don't care because, this has gone on for too long type situation. I think there's a lot of kind of societal political feelings that also they're trying to quash in Brussels, where there's also a lot of pressure to actually do something.
Yeah, and there will be a lot of disappointment, as we can see already with the OSA, disappointing some stakeholders.
Disappointing before anything is put in place.
DSA is going to disappoint many people as well, because people have all kinds of expectations and project their expectations into the project. So further questions. I forgot to say, if you could first speak to the mic and switch on the mic when you speak, and also introduce yourself. Just that we know, and also people online can hear your question. So that was my omission. Yes, please.
Wow.
Do you hold it down?
Can you hold it?
Just hold it permanently.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
need to hold it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so my name's David Cook. I actually work for a VLOP. I am from ALO. We operate Pornhub, amongst other adult content websites. And I just wanted to pick up on a few things, just give you a bit of an insight into some thought processes when we're conducting our risk assessment. We're actually going through an audit right now because we were designated somewhat later than other VLOPs. But just when you start thinking about risk assessments being conducted in a vacuum, they're being conducted on a per platform basis. And then going back to what the lady said over there regarding outcomes and the focus on outcomes, and her point was that the outcome of the platform being compliant. Well, I think it's wider than that. I think you have to think about the outcome of what the lawmaker intended to achieve by creating this law in the first place. So to use an example of protection of minors, Article 28, though it's not specifically mentioned within that article, there is probably an expectation that adult sites should put age verification, hard age verification measures, very similar to what's going to be required under the Online Services Act, get that in place. However, in our experience and evidenced all over the world, specifically in the US, but also testing we've done in France, if we put in hard age verification measures, all of our competitors do not. And most, I would say 99% of all our competitors have got no idea about compliance with the DSA, have not done anything with any of their platforms on any level whatsoever. There are 3 of us that have been designated as VLOPs. Pornhub is one of them, 2 of them are competitors. But outside of that, and even probably inside of that, but outside of that, no one has done anything. So we put age verification in place. People go to an adult website and go, you want my passport, my driving license, my credit card, you want to scan my face, you want to do something to prove I'm over 18. However much we say we're not taking that data, that's taken by a third party, we don't see any of that, it's deleted, which is all true. If we did, if someone goes and tries to do that, when there are millions, literally millions of alternatives, they will go to the alternatives. So have you protected minors? So what I'm saying from that is, well, I conduct a risk assessment and go, okay, there's a risk of minors visiting our site. How do I mitigate that risk? Okay, I should put age verification in place. Oh, but if I do that, that's going to mean everyone goes to other sites which don't have any moderation, which haven't even looked at the DSA, which don't check identity, don't do identity verification, don't moderate every single video and image before it's published, which is what we do. So actually, you've created a greater risk by mitigating that risk, but that risk is apparent outside of our platforms. So it's even harder when you're looking at the internet as a whole and how you can think, what is going to happen if I mitigate this risk in this particular way? Even though that's the expectation of the regulator, if we did it, actually, things will get worse for everybody. So we can't. And we do support age verification. There's a huge amount that could go into it about doing it properly, but doing it in the way that the OSA suggests is not going to work, and the way that the European Commission suggests hasn't worked.
So can I have just one follow-up? So would it be any different if so implied in your comment is that it's VLOP specific, that expectation of age verification. If that wasn't the case, and it would be specific to all online platforms on the base of 28, so it would extend to many more companies, yet still not everyone, would that change your consideration or calculation, or not really?
It would have very slight bearing on it. Yes, there is a possibility it could just apply to VLOPs, which is complete nonsense because there's clearly more than 3 adult websites in the world, and some of those are bigger than us and just not designated as VLOPs. But even when you say, like the OSA does, actually it applies to everybody. Doesn't matter whether you're very large or not, you need to do it. Well, what we've seen in the US, we've complied, everyone else has ignored it. In about 12 states in the US now, we complied. In Louisiana, we've blocked goodness knows how many states they've put it in place because we don't agree with it, because it doesn't work, it doesn't protect minors, it's privacy risk, all the rest of these things. It introduces so many more risks around data, pushing data around the internet in general, personal identifiable information. So it doesn't make a difference unless a law only works if there's mass compliance or mass enforcement, or both. And in our industry, we're not a social media platform. There's no loyalty. It's not like you go, oh, I have to go to Pornhub because that's where my friends are, and I like to follow celebrities. You know, we're not Instagram, we're not Meta, we're not Facebook. So you have to. People will go to find what they want somewhere, and it's not hard to find anywhere on the internet. So that's where people will go. And unless you enforce it, has there been any enforcement against any adult site that's not complied with the law yet? No, and probably won't be, because they've got bigger fish to fry. They're doing other things. So less of a question, more of a comment, but just to give you an insight about how difficult these things can be. And on the face of it, you look at it and go, well, surely they should, if they cared about children, they should be doing this. Okay, but if you do this, it's going to make it worse. So actually, we're not going to do it like that. And I can tell you how to do it, but I don't want to take over the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for that. That was
yeah, I'd quite like to respond. I'm very, very sympathetic with it. And I think that's a really very acute example. But it's not. It's something which is also, non-adult website lots will experience as well. For instance, the idea of driving people off platform to have conversations that that they can have on unregulated parts of the internet, because of a squeezing of maybe the last how many % of questionable speech. Squeezing, can you squeeze too far? I think that's a really difficult question, but has to remain central. The DSA, the original germ of the DSA was around protecting things like rights of freedom of expression and rights to access information. So that's where I think I'd like to see a pendulum swing a little bit back in regulatory attention, not only to there's 3 words in the Article 35, reasonable, God, no, I've forgotten them.
effective and proportionate.
Effective and proportionate, but there's a lot of interest in the effective. What about the balancing with the reasonable and proportionate? And then, as you've said, it will wear thin very, very quickly for platforms when they see, and they can see right now, and I'm aware of many instances of some VLOPs doing less, some VLOPs doing more, but no enforcement action coming on the ones, or no even attention coming on the ones that are doing less than others. And you'll have ones who have gone and done a lot more, investing huge amounts, going, why don't we just roll it all back to what so-and-so's doing, So just a comment back in sympathy and in the complexity of the situation. Yeah.
So I have one follow-up, but I still want to get questions from the room before that. Just a note, I'm not trying to turn this into a 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast, but we can stay a little bit longer because there's no one coming after us. So unless you really desperately want to leave for whatever reason, just stick around. Please, can you just switch on the mic and state your name as well?
Let's see. Hi.
Yes, but you need to keep holding it.
I think I am. Let me know if my voices disappear. Hi. Filippo here, and I have a question about the audits. So we discussed about the DSA audits, and my impression was that one of the most significant novelties or new things that the DSA introduced is that the companies are basically audited against the benchmarks that they are themselves providing, right? Which means that the outcome of this could be a positive, could be a negative, and it might seem like a straightforward exercise because you are providing your own benchmarks, but we saw in the comparison that mostly every company, apart from Wikipedia, got a negative overall opinion. So if this is true, and companies are audited against their own benchmarks and what they believe is sufficient, is reasonable, is proportionate, and is also accurate and complete, in your view, how would that trigger the no opinion conclusions?
The no opinion can occur for a variety of reasons. One reason, which we touched upon earlier, is that you don't have access to the information necessary to form an opinion. Probably the most extreme example of that is you're under the company is under investigation for compliance with a specific requirement. And it might, can maybe seem a little self-serving, and the regular auditor kind of checks out at that point. But they don't actually check out, just for the record. They continue the audit. They just don't reach an opinion. And if they found something which confirms non-compliance, they would reach a negative conclusion. Most of them are just at that point going, I can't reach a positive conclusion because I assume the regulator is enforcing for a reason. And they won't tell me what that is. They won't give me that information. So there's something beyond. The other reasons for no opinions, I think it's going to depend. But usually that would be it would be that based upon I can't get access to the information. The information doesn't exist. The environment's not suitable to perform an audit. Something like that. Well, your question, I thought, was leading in a different direction. I won't go into it. Lorna and anyone else is welcome to weigh in. Yeah.
I think there was one no opinion as well provided because the platform did not provide sufficient information, which was a different no opinion, right? So can't give an opinion. And in that case, they didn't found it negative either. They said we can't say which one it is. I think the reason was it was for the FDI audit, and I think the reason of potentially not finding it negative was that the other circumstantial evidence around it wasn't showing necessarily a negative opinion, but then there wasn't enough to actually give.
Auditors don't think negative. Auditors think negative opinions are bad. Rather, no opinions. Auditors are like, if you think of a financial audit, right? If it was riddled with no opinions, you'd be in big trouble. Maybe one can see a school of thought where some platforms might go, oh, no opinion, this sounds pretty good, I quite like this. You do have an obligation under the law to be audited on compliance with all the requirements. So no opinions they don't mesh with that, and so at a certain point, it's going to attract the attention of, scrutiny of whether you actually have complied with the audit requirements. But there can be reasons that those no opinions, again, I think coming back to your colleague or peer beside you, those can flow from lack of preparation time, lack of structure internally, things like that. The information's not available, we just can't get it to you. It's not feasible or something like that. Usually it just doesn't exist, something like that. I thought your benchmarks point was going to be about comparability, which is a really interesting one. And I suppose there's an interesting story behind that. And originally in the Delegated Act, it said that if the auditors don't like the benchmarks, they can substitute them for their own. And auditors said, No way, Jose, right? We're not doing this. It's not a, do you really want, is it really our place? No, it's not our place. And it's management's responsibility to select, to interpret the law, apply it to itself, and figure out how to comply with it. Either regulator, give us more time, let's all work together and come up with a set of industry standard type criteria and benchmarks, or we are provided benchmarks. And at the end of the day, it's public reports, the benchmarks are always going to be in there. You can compare apples to oranges, and feasibly some platforms which may be, being more, their benchmarks are harder on themselves. Maybe it led to a negative in some respect, but at least you would be able to see, oh, well, actually, that was a really hard benchmark they set themselves. But it does precipitate a potential race to the bottom, right, in terms of going, like, well, I'll pick the easy one.
In a way, you could say that the DSA codes of conduct are essentially a way to solidify some of those benchmarks, right? You have to voluntarily sort of agree to that.
You read them,
but when you,
they're not particularly
well, that's the other question, right? Yeah. But there's also concern, for instance, that, there's a lot of incentives in developing these DSA codes of conduct. Certainly for the member states, certainly for the regulator, less so for the VLOPs and VLOSs. However, if they do come up with something more detailed, some KPIs and benchmarks, that completely changes the dynamics of auditing, doesn't it? And of the self-assessment. It certainly expands it further, changes because you cannot have your own benchmark, so you need to at least check against your own benchmark and third-party benchmarks. So do you have any thoughts on that, how codes of conduct then effectively change dynamics of the auditing and the assessment of the risks, because they come with a third-party benchmarks and KPIs into the, and potentially risk mitigation measures into the whole exercise, right? So now it's not entirely, now obviously they have their special position in enforceability, right? They're not doing all like this as a safe harbor, but they're also not binding. So, but it's very hard to argue if you have signed up to code of conduct and there are some benchmarks that can be operationalized and you don't do that. And then the auditor would, for instance, be expected to do that, let's say, or checks against those benchmarks will. That would be a very hard position for a company, I presume. So they are, in that sense, soft pressure on the companies.
But I think, so the way the DSA envisions it is that the code of conduct, so if a company signs up, says these are the commitments that I abide to, they kind of turn into quasi-obligations. So the auditor is expected to audit against them.
Sure.
So,
but the Commission can only find on the basis of the DSA. They cannot enforce an obligation. So they still have to find the provision in the DSA that backs up that obligation, and still have to make a case for that.
But sure. So I think timely is probably the easiest one there, right? So companies sign up to the Code of Conduct on Hate Speech, and it has certain time requirements, right? So that would become the benchmark for timely removal of hate speech, right? So from that perspective, I think, from my perspective, that then becomes an auditable opinion with a clear benchmark, according to.
Well, so this whole idea of benchmarks, right, is typically you need what's called suitable criteria to perform an audit. DSA doesn't always provide suitable criteria, so they're asking platforms to, where necessary, to provide suitable criteria. Where necessary. If the law is the ideal source of criteria. If the law says do it in 24 hours, there's not going to be any discussion about whether or not you can do it in 36. Yep. That will be provided for in the law. So you'd be audited on that basis. I think, those kinds of benchmarks are not going to be the challenging ones. It's not going to be challenging for most platforms to demonstrate that they take down the extreme majority of hate speech within 24 hours. The risk is more the other. They take it down too fast, frankly. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean?
Well, you can have the opposite benchmark.
Yeah, but I think it's the hard. There is a lot of merit to the argument that forcing a standardization across all kinds of benchmarks in the DSA would not be sensible, because platforms and companies are different. They should interpret some of these things differently. It comes back to being, what's reasonable and pertinent and appropriate for your business. But there will be areas where that is the case, and there'll be other areas where it's sensible to standardize them.
Yep. Okay.
I think that's one of the key elements where anyone looking at these reports should also take to due care of, right? For some platforms, certain benchmarks make sense, especially for kind of content areas, but also in terms of marketplaces, what types of risks to focus on, what types of, there's a reason why DSA is written the way it's written. It has to apply to so many different types of services. So of course now we're grappling with the ambiguity of that, but ultimately it's something that we have to grapple with.
Well, in some of the pending lawsuits, some companies argue that marketplaces were never supposed to be covered by the risk management system. And even adult sites. What are yours? Okay, any other questions in the room? Yes, please.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all the speakers and Martin for a really fascinating session. My name is Maria Donde. I work for Commission Naman, which is the Irish Digital Service Coordinator. I have a question. I was struck by something that Anna said about the third parties, the involvement of third parties and possible participation in some of this process. I mean, as I'm sure you all know, we are currently in the process of working with the Commission within the Digital Services Board to produce a first report on systemic risk, which will, so I was fascinated by the discussion earlier about systemic risk versus or the conceptions of systemic regulation and so on, and I think there'll be some useful things, or certainly some of your discussion I would like to take back to that process. But you know, I think what we're seeing is very much an iterative process with all of these transparency reports, risk assessments, and audits included. That's certainly how the Commission is phrasing it, and I think there are arguments, both different ways. It's definitely one way of looking at it is that we will be able to produce increasingly detailed and helpful, hopefully, guidance about how all of this should be done based on real-world examples of all of these processes as they continue. One of the things that I was struck by when the reports were published in November was criticism from, unsurprisingly, from civil society that some of the auditors who had done this work had not sufficiently consulted with experts within the civil society space to produce their reports, really. So I was actually curious to know, and of course the Commission is currently running a number of roundtables with civil society to feed into its own assessment of the audits and the risk assessment reports and so on. I just wondered whether you had any sort of experience of that, whether you had any reflections on that, and whether there was a role here or any kind of potential here for other third parties to be more involved and to contribute to the improvement of all of these processes. Thank you.
Who wants to take that one?
I just want to prove I'm a true academic and go for something abstract, or a more abstract comment, which is if you look at the UN GPs, there is a strong assumption that, if you like, the people whose rights are at risk should be properly involved, consulted in the process. Now, on a narrow point, you have got fundamental human rights in that list. So you could say that fundamental rights assessment element, insofar as you're separating that out, needs to reflect UNGPs, sort of needs to point back to that. And there is a question of whether, more generally, in terms of understanding risks and understanding the impact, that needs to be engaged. I think there is a huge problem around quantification of harm. And I think sometimes the language we use to talk about things loses that. To give an example, unfortunately I'm drifting back to human rights again, when we talk about, say, the encryption debate, rightly, privacy is front and centre, but then you get the countervailing concern, say, children and CSAM, being talked about as safety of children, as though it's a sort of general societal interest, rather than the Article 3 rights or the Article 4 rights or even the Article 2 rights of those children. So I think sometimes getting survivor voices or victim voices involved can be important in understanding actually where the problem is, what the nature is, because sometimes what we think is happening is not, and that's as true in that part of the terrain as elsewhere.
Excellent. Last question. Anyone?
I think I've silenced everybody.
No, I think it's the fact that it's 2.5 hours now.
And we're running out of oxygen.
Okay, I think that for a sign that we should finish. I have one last question for all three of you, and it's kind of a double question, but it's related. So one is, could we have some sort of comparison, benchmarking between the compliance that compares how different companies are doing? Because I hear a lot from companies that those that invest more, at least claim to invest more, you never know, that they don't see their efforts recognized, because kind of coming back to your comments, there's someone else who just pays a lip service to the compliance. So is there a way how to quantify somehow so you can have a ranking or some sort of comparison of these different, and let's stick to VLOPs only for the purposes of this, so they get some recognition and hence maybe incentive going forward. Even though you're not fully compliant, you probably never will be. Right? It's almost so big so that you can never be fully compliant. Related to that, you made remarks about Commission not giving sufficient guidance. So what type of guidance you think would be the most needed, and what is the style? Are you talking about Ofcom style guidance? Probably not. So what exactly are you talking about when you would talk about guidance? What would be the useful one, right? And we also had with Lorna many discussions about this. What's the optimal level of guidance? So if you could address those, feel free to pick one if you don't like the other. Who wants to go first?
Curtis does.
Curtis. There we go.
So first question, other than the guidance one, what was it?
It was the gold stars, wasn't it?
Right, the comparison.
Gold
Okay,
stars.
yeah, gold stars.
Can we have a board with gold stars?
No, I don't. Sorry, your name is
Maybe
not
on
mine. I am very. I'm only speaking in a personal capacity. I think this is a space which is very, very complicated, and the idea of reducing it to some kind of stack rank seems like you're just going. The audit was hard. That was hard to do that. That was hard to understand compliance and risk management, risk assessments. That was hard to understand, and it's just getting more and more reductionist. Whereas, I do like to think of these things as being not about. It's a just so everyone is aware, for instance, that it is a fairly unique regulatory device to make the audit labels be positive with comments, negative. The audits otherwise would have followed normal assurance language, probably, and we would have said, our opinion, but for the following, recommendations. It would either be a modified or an unmodified opinion. It would not be about sort of pinning particular companies to particular positions. So I wouldn't like probably to see that kind of thing from the Commission. Certainly, I think it's much more nuanced than that, and probably what most companies want is a relationship between the Commission or their DSCs, which they feel is bilateral and appreciates the nuance, as opposed to
Public.
a one-way,
Right.
public
Okay.
something.
Curtis took what I wanted to say. Put it, I think, even more elegantly than I would have said.
You can still,
So it
by
was-
guidance, you can still.
I can still measure something from guidance. And then, no, but Lorna always has good things to say, so I'm not worried about her. So, and I fully agree with you on this, and I just wanted to emphasize this. I really do think that ultimately what we do, like, of course, we're trying to regulate these big systems and big risks and things which are very material risks to our society, very close to our hearts, right? We're concerned about certain outcomes that are coming, but these are complicated, nuanced. But behind this are people, right? People in the regulators, people in the commission, people in these companies really kind of trying. And I think what actually is something to strive for is a relationship which is constructive across these, right? So as long as you're having a good faith discussion, it is something that I think ultimately will be appreciated across the board. And just to also, and why I think it's also a struggle for everyone, it's an immense time pressure under which everyone's working, under a high degree of uncertainty, a high degree of pressure from internally to show results very quickly and all of this. And so I think once we get over this, and in a couple of years, I hope this can become a more calm environment where there is even boring, right? Even slightly, I think ultimately you want this to be a bit more boring. It's not boring enough. I mean, we've had thousands of pages of reports, and I still don't find this space boring enough, right? It needs to get down to a bit more boring, I would say. But on your second question on guidance, yes, I wouldn't say, I think, it's a very good question of what is actually meaningful and useful. And I think a couple of things that I've outlined in the presentation, which I kind of sped through, is a couple of things to focus on is for the Commission to give some instance of clarity around the level of analysis, the level of scoring, and the types of methodologies they, I think, find useful. I think that would be actually helpful, of kind of what's the expectation, what type of data should be required, what is useful. That's something that should be questioned. In all of this, I think they should clarify what does it mean to make it specific to the service. Right now, there's unclarity on the market of specificity, right? There's 4 categories of risk with potentially endless subcategories, really. I mean, all illegal content in the EU, what does this mean, right? There was a research article which concluded it's a potentially, in Germany, that would be like 100 different laws, right? Like, it's mad, like, if you take it to the extreme, right? But so, and what does this mean between these risks to make it specific to the service? And I think that would allow also for some companies to go deeper in certain types of risks. Then potentially also, like, if you're seeing on these baseline risks certain heightened risks, or if you have these functionalities, then maybe kind of a deeper dive. So there's, I think, kind of certain additional principles that could be worked on. And also, what does it mean to then discuss content functionality risks? Where is the bar? Where should the bar be set there? And I think these are kind of elements which would be very helpful to get further guidance and understanding on. And even though I think in companies it's like kind of, it can't, in some cases I think the companies wouldn't mind to do a bit more in certain areas, but just to be told what it is that is wanted, what would kind of move the needle and bring a smile to someone's face, finally, in a way, right? Like, what would...
Excellent. Lorna?
I mean, I think some gold stars, they sound lovely in theory, but we've got a regulatory background that makes that so difficult that that I can't see how it would work. And I was just thinking when you asked the question of things like the various newspapers ranking universities, and how, in a way, random that sometimes seems.
But it influences choices the students make.
Yeah, and so I just thought, nice but impractical. In terms of guidance, I mean, what were you thinking about guidance?
So what's the optimal level of guidance, or how much? Because Commission is much more flexible in how much guidance they have to give.
Yeah,
compared
well,
to
I suppose it guidance on a risk assessment or guidance on what they put in their little output report. I mean, I think in terms of sort of the outputs, I mean, a common language would be nice if we could get, sort of the sector and the auditors maybe using the same words to describe the same sort of thing, and maybe saying 1 is the top and 10 is the bottom, not vice versa. And, you know, sort of, I think you can do nuts and bolts that might make then comparison a little bit easier. I think in terms of guidance on the risk assessment themselves, I mean, there's lots of risk assessment literature out there. So maybe actually would some mocked up case studies help? Or, I mean, I don't know. I've not really thought
Sounds like a
about
lot of
it.
work for them.
Yeah, I mean, it would be. But that's the other problem is, you know, who has the capacity.
I'd be interested, this is the thing I said I find difficult right now. I'd be interested to know how regulators feel around this question of how deep the layer of the onion ought we be going. It said do this for all, you know, it said implement a functionality that allows a user to declare content as commercial. What were you thinking when you wrote that word content? How deep did you really want us or expect us to go? You know what I mean? And what about on those other dimensions of the Rubik's Cube? So, you know, all the increasingly obscure or less trafficked surfaces of our products. Did you have all of these in mind? Did you expect 100% coverage, or would you actually go, wow, you've gone far beyond what we ever expected you would do. You've implemented it for the thing that 2% of users ever see. You know, that would be interesting. I probably more in an informal capacity, you know, than in public guidance, because it's going to, again, if doing it right, it would come back to a useful assessment of risk to make those decisions. You know, is it worth it? Is it from a risk-based perspective? Should it be on that surface or on that product? But it doesn't seem to be clear from the law that you really have that.
So I can see that you emphasize a lot that bilateral sometimes is enough, both in terms of guidance as well as in terms of recognition in the relationship between regulator and regulatee. So not necessarily all the guidance has to be public sort of guidance to which you commit.
And I'm also really answering the question in many respects from the perspective of auditors. How deep do you want us to go? You know, I mean, I have heard tell that sometimes the regulator has heard of pouring over data infrastructures to follow data migration through many systems, you know, to get there and going, wow, I didn't really expect that was what this was going to happen. Whether or not those reports are true or not, it would be interesting to know. And there's no time like the present, it's already cracking into the next ones, you know, on whether or not this is, I mean, regulator is fundamentally the user of this report. Auditor perspective, in fact, they are the only user of the report other than the platform themselves. So audit reports are always developed from the perspective of what does the user of the report need? Would this information be misleading to the user of the report? Is it helpful to the user of the report to make their decisions? So there's not a lot of conversation between the auditors and the users of the report right now, to the best of my knowledge. Yeah.
Well, there are many users of your report in this room.
From an auditor perspective, there's not. There's not.
I understand.
You know?
Yeah, functionally, there's only one that sits in Brussels. Okay, with that, I think let that be the final word. Thank you so much for giving us 2 hours and 45 minutes of your life. I hope this was enriching and you found it useful, and we hope to organize some of these in the future again. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking the participants again, the speakers.